On the evening of December 18th, 2011, a black Chevrolet Blazer sat abandoned near the corner of Ninth Street and St. Clair Avenue in East St. Louis, Illinois. The engine was idling and the driver's door was hanging open, as if someone had just stepped out briefly. Inside were a young woman's prescription glasses, her purse, and her shoes, and as it turned out, the 23-year-old who'd been driving it was nowhere in sight. That's the narrative the Phoenix Colden case was built on, and it's appeared in nearly every article, podcast, and television segment about her for close to 15 years. Here's the problem. According to the police officer who actually walked up to that truck, it never happened that way. The most famous fact in the Phoenix case may not be a fact at all, and the space between the two versions may be key to solving this mysterious disappearance. Phoenix was born on May 23, 1988 in California, under the name Phoenix Reeves, her mother Goldia's maiden name. The family later moved to Missouri for her stepfather Lawrence Colden's work, and there he formally adopted her, giving her the name she'd carry into adulthood. Home was Country Brook Drive in Spanish Lake, an unincorporated suburb tucked into the northern edge of St. Louis County. By every early account, the Coldens built a tight, sheltered, deeply religious household around their only child. Goldia homeschooled her through high school, and Phoenix played piano, violin, and guitar, and she was reportedly a junior fencing champion in the St. Louis area. By December of 2011, she was 23, living at home and studying at the University of Missouri St. Louis, where her parents understood her to be partway through her degree. Her parents' rules hadn't loosened much with adulthood, something that's going to play a fairly large role in this story. Dating before marriage was off the table entirely, and the family's life revolved around church. None of that seemed to bother Phoenix outwardly, though as we will see, looks can often be deceiving. December 18th, 2011 was a Sunday, and Phoenix went to church that morning with her mother, stopped for groceries, and spent part of the afternoon shooting baskets outside her house. She was dressed in gray sweatpants, a dark hooded sweatshirt, and black sneakers. Sometime between 2:20 and 3, she got into the family's black 1998 Chevrolet Blazer, which was parked in the driveway. She didn't announce a destination, and her father assumed she was headed to the convenience store around the corner, or maybe to a friend's house. The sheer casualness of the moment is exactly why nobody worried at the time, since she wasn't dressed for anything in particular. A friend's mother would later report seeing Phoenix driving as late as 4:30 that afternoon, which, if accurate, is the last time anyone from her world laid eyes on her. At 5:27 that evening, police in East St. Louis, Illinois, took a report of an abandoned vehicle in the 900 block of St. Clair Avenue near the corner of 9th Street. It was the Colden's Blazer, roughly a 25-minute drive from the house, across the Mississippi River, and across a state line. Her family knew of no errand that could have taken her to that corner, though her grandmother reportedly lived in East St. Louis, so the city itself wasn't foreign to her. What's certain is that it was a hard place to break down, if that is indeed what happened. East St. Louis in 2011 carried one of the worst violent crime rates of any small city in America. The stretch of St. Clair Avenue where the truck turned up sat along a corridor known for every sort of illicit activity imaginable. At 6:23 that evening, a tow truck hauled the Blazer to an impound lot, where it was logged as an ordinary abandoned vehicle. Nobody connected it to a missing person, because at that moment, Phoenix wasn't missing yet. Her parents reported her missing to the St. Louis County Police the next day, December 19th, and here the case dropped into a bureaucratic crack it never fully climbed out of. The truck had been towed in Illinois before the missing person report was filed in Missouri, so the license plate was never flagged in any system on either side of the river. The county police spent the following days looking for a woman and a vehicle that, unknown to them, was already sitting in a tow lot across the Mississippi. For the next 2 weeks, the Coldens searched for a truck the authorities already had. They printed flyers and called hospitals, and they kept searching on their own while the single biggest piece of physical evidence in their daughter's case sat untouched in an impound lot. The family didn't learn where the Blazer was until the first days of January 2012, and they didn't learn it from the police. A family friend searching independently tracked the truck to the East St. Louis lot, and when the Coldens arrived to claim it, they were met with a shock. They were handed a bill of roughly $1,000 in tow and storage fees, which was waived only after they appealed to the mayor's office. An officer reportedly told the family that no inventory sheet had been made because there had been nothing in the car worth listing. When the Coldens finally got the truck back, they found Phoenix's eyeglasses, her purse with her driver's license inside, her shoes, and a cell phone bill that had gone to collections. The glasses in particular gnawed at her parents, who couldn't picture their daughter voluntarily walking away without them. Later forensic testing of the vehicle found genetic evidence from only 3 people in the vehicle, Phoenix and her 2 parents. The family has said that after February 2012, communication from the East St. Louis police effectively stopped. Goldia and Lawrence took up the work themselves, going so far as to walk the St. Clair corridor and question the street-level dealers and streetwalkers who worked it. What little money the Coldens had went into the search, and in the spring of 2012, a stranger took the rest of it. A man contacted the family claiming to know where Phoenix was, offering details Goldia later described as extremely convincing, and pointing them toward Texas. The Coldens hired private investigators to chase the lead and drained their life savings doing it. The tip was a fabrication, and the man admitted as much only after the money was gone. The family's home on Country Brook Drive went into foreclosure. Within a year of their daughter's disappearance, the Coldens had lost Phoenix, their savings, and the house she'd grown up in, and the case itself had gone completely cold. The case stayed completely cold for the better part of 7 years, and it wasn't until it got national media attention that anything started happening again. On November 3rd and 4th, 2018, a 2-night special called The Disappearance of Phoenix Colden aired on the Oxygen Network. It was built around a fresh investigation by Chandria Thomas, a St. Louis television journalist, and Joe Delia, a retired deputy police chief. What they found changed the shape of the case, because the sheltered homeschooled girl of the early coverage turned out to be only half the story. Phoenix, it emerged, had been living a carefully compartmentalized life that she kept hidden from her parents. She had at least 2 boyfriends her parents knew nothing about, in a household where dating wasn't allowed at all. For a stretch of her college years, she stayed part of the time with a man identified publicly only as Michael, while her parents believed she was simply at school. She kept a second cell phone that even her boyfriend didn't know about, and the bill found in the truck traced back to it. She also had 2 birth certificates, one under Reeves and one under Colden, a perfectly ordinary artifact of her adoption that suddenly looked significant in hindsight. She had also stopped being a college student, despite what her parents were led to believe. Investigators found she'd dropped her classes and hadn't enrolled for the spring semester, something her parents apparently never knew. There was also a video Phoenix had recorded of herself in which she talked about wanting to start over. In the video, she said she couldn't remember the last time she'd been happy, and seemed to suggest something more serious was going on. A close friend described her as visibly changed in her final 6 months, on edge, uncharacteristically aggressive, and reportedly carrying a knife for protection. Then there were the phone records, and on December 17th, the day before Phoenix vanished, she and Michael called each other 10 times, and the final call lasted almost 2 hours. On the day of the disappearance itself, her phone logged a 6-minute incoming call and a 1-minute outgoing call connected to his number. Questioned by police about what those hours of conversation had been about, he told them he couldn't remember. Lawrence Colden considered him evasive and said so publicly, but investigators had a different take on the matter. One detective described Michael as among the most cooperative figures in the entire file and expressed confidence that he had nothing to do with Phoenix's disappearance. And then there was the truck, and Thomas and Delia, the true crime documentary makers, went looking for the origin of the idling engine and the open driver's door. These details had defined this case from the beginning, and they found Kendall Perry, the officer who'd responded to the abandoned vehicle call that December evening in 2011. His account was flatly different, and he said that the engine was off and the doors were closed. Further, the lights weren't on and the keys weren't in the ignition. To Officer Perry, there'd been nothing about the scene to raise a red flag, just an ordinary abandoned truck that looked for all the world like it had run out of gas. Ultimately, the Oxygen documentary was unable to confirm how this narrative inserted itself into the case. What was clear is that by then the idling engine narrative had traveled everywhere, even onto the Missouri State Highway Patrol's official missing person bulletin. Yet despite this widespread so-called fact, the reinvestigation couldn't trace it back to a single witness who'd actually seen it. What's left is a case with at least 3 possibilities and not enough evidence to close any of them. The first is that Phoenix was taken, and the truck came to rest on a corridor investigators describe as part of one of the country's busiest trafficking routes. In 2014, a friend reportedly saw a woman who looked strikingly like Phoenix, boarding a flight from Las Vegas to St. Louis. She was traveling with a group of similar-looking young women and 2 imposing men, and the woman reacted to Phoenix's name without answering to it. There's also been speculation, nothing official, that one of Phoenix's quote-unquote boyfriends wasn't actually a boyfriend at all. Simply put, he had trafficked her and then passed her off to someone else, with her ultimate fate being unknown. Some have speculated that, as the case ended up gaining a national profile, one of the traffickers may have killed her. Ultimately, though, that's speculation upon speculation, though unfortunately it doesn't seem that far-fetched. The second road is that Phoenix left on her own of her own free will, and this is of course the most hopeful version of events. She dropped out of school without telling her parents, kept whole relationships hidden, and recorded herself talking about starting over. She also had a copy of the birth certificate under her original name, which is potentially quite important if she wanted to take on a new life. Records briefly linked the name Phoenix Reeves to an address in Anchorage, Alaska, in the months after she disappeared. Investigators ended up visiting the address and ran into a confused homeowner who had never heard of anyone by that name. Still, it indicated that someone, for some reason, was using an extremely rare name and linking it to an address. Ultimately, though, I find this theory extremely difficult to accept, even though I would obviously prefer it to be true. A woman planning her own exit generally takes her glasses, her license, and her purse. The prescription glasses in particular strike me as a very bizarre thing to leave behind under a voluntary disappearance scenario. Her bank account also had some money left in it, and people who are trying to start a new life don't generally simply leave behind cash. The third theory is the simplest, that the truck simply ran dry in an unfamiliar and unforgiving part of town as dusk came on. It's possible that Phoenix was visiting a family member or a friend when gas ran out in one of the most dangerous parts of America. Phoenix may have then accepted help from the wrong person, or she may have been abducted, meeting a grim fate soon after. The St. Louis County Police still treat Phoenix Colden as an open missing person case, and the Missouri State Highway Patrol still circulates her bulletin. Her parents have never stopped looking, and for years after she disappeared, her parents kept the family Christmas tree standing with her presents beneath it, waiting to be opened. She'd left a week before Christmas, and they intended to finish the holiday when she came home. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual quick reminder to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership if you enjoy my content and want to support my channel even further. On April 22nd, 1940, the police department in Brookline, Massachusetts, finally issued a missing persons bulletin for a local housewife. It described Barbara Rogers, age 26, 5'7", 125 pounds, brown eyes, dark auburn hair worn in a long bob. She'd been gone more than 4 months by then, and the bulletin landed with no impact at all. No newspaper picked it up. No reporter asked a single question. And that's the strangest part, because the woman on that bulletin wasn't an anonymous housewife. Under her maiden name, Barbara Newhall Follett had been one of the most celebrated literary prodigies in American history. She was a novelist praised by the New York Times before she was old enough for high school. When she walked out of her apartment on a December evening in 1939, the whole country should have noticed. Instead, it took 26 years for anyone outside her family to realize she was gone. Barbara Newhall Follett was born on March 4, 1914, in Hanover, New Hampshire. Her father, Wilson Follett, was a literary critic and editor, and her mother, Helen, was a former school teacher who educated Barbara at home. Barbara discovered her father's typewriter as a toddler and became obsessed, typing away by 4 and producing her first little stories by 5. By age 7, she'd invented an entire imaginary world she called Farksolia, complete with its own history, capital city, and a constructed language named Farkso. She developed it with the seriousness of a philologist, compiling a grammar and a vocabulary that eventually filled filing cabinets. In 1923, at age 8, she began typing a novel as a birthday present for her mother. It told the story of a girl named Eppersep who runs away from home to live wild in nature. Her grieving parents chase after her while she dances further out of reach through meadow, seashore, and mountain. Honestly, it sounds like an ultra-whimsical Studio Ghibli film, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't already been adapted. Then, real life happened, and the family's house caught fire, and the manuscript burned with it. Barbara started over and spent the next 3 years rebuilding the book from memory, along with all the world-building lore she had constructed. Her father showed the finished result to his contacts at a variety of publishers in early 1927, and the publishers expressed a serious interest in the work. When Barbara was 12, the completed work appeared in bookstores as The House Without Windows. The reviews were remarkable, and the New York Times treated the novel as an unprecedented document of inner imagination. Another prominent review described its beauty as almost too much to bear, and even H.L. Mencken, a man not famous for gushing, counted himself an admirer. Not everyone cheered, but not due to the quality of the work itself. Some critics noted that publishing a successful novel before age 13 might be less a blessing than a handicap, the kind of early peak a life never recovers from. Barbara fired back to these criticisms, insisting that the book was simply an expression of joy. Unfortunately, though, based on her later life, these critics may have been at least partially correct. Barbara didn't slow down, and in June 1927, at 13, she shipped out on a coastal lumber schooner called the Normandie. And yes, you heard me correctly, that wasn't the Normandy like the famous region of France. That was the Normandie. A clever little wordplay. She sailed from New Haven up to Nova Scotia, living alongside the crew and taking notes the whole way. The book she wrote about the voyage was published the following year, and reviewers were arguably more impressed the second time. One critic marveled that the craftsmanship of the work would have done credit to a veteran writer. Some questioned whether it was even possible for someone of her age to produce such meaningful literature, suggesting her father may have had a significant editorial hand. By then, she was 14, twice published, and by any reasonable measure standing at the start of a spectacular career. But what happened then is the fate of so many prodigies, and she never published another book for the rest of her life. That isn't to say she wouldn't complete a novel, but to put it in context, her next manuscript wouldn't be published until 2020. The collapse came from two directions at once, and the first was her father. In 1928, Wilson Follett left the family for a younger woman, allegedly using his slice of the earnings of Barbara's books to win this woman over. Barbara, for her part, was clearly a keen and intelligent teenager who could work out the role she played in the causation on that, and this hit her hard. Wilson had also been her editor and her closest intellectual companion, and she wrote to him pleading that even if others needed him, she needed her dad more than anyone else did. Wilson, however, was selfish, and he left anyway, and after that, he reportedly provided little money to assist the family. Helen responded by taking Barbara to sea, sailing with her through the Caribbean and the South Pacific to gather material for a travel book. But the voyage unraveled, and through circumstances that aren't quite clear, Barbara was left with family friends in California. It's been suggested that Helen had some sort of breakdown as a result of Wilson leaving, but ultimately, it was the 1920s, and this wasn't well documented. In September 1929, the 15-year-old ran away from the family friends, fleeing to San Francisco and hiding in a hotel under a false name before police tracked her down. The second blow hit everyone equally, and weeks after she was found, the stock market collapsed, and the Follett household's now thin finances gave out. By 1930, the girl the papers had once called a genius was 16 years old and working as a secretary in New York City, typing other people's words for a paycheck. Her letters from this period have been preserved, and in one, she described her dreams as dying, cut down by a world that ran on time and money. She kept writing before work in the early mornings, producing a novel called Lost Island, about a young woman who escapes the grind of New York for a remote island. It's a book that opens with rain hammering the city as if the weather itself had a grudge against everyone in it. Alongside it, she finished a travel manuscript called Travels Without a Donkey, about a long walk from northern Maine down to the Massachusetts border. Neither found a publisher in her lifetime, and by 1934, she'd essentially stopped writing. And when I say that she stopped writing, I mean that she stopped writing things that she assumed would one day be published. She kept actively writing letters, and in her own private diary, something that has given us remarkable insight into her mind state leading up to her mysterious disappearance. The one bright thing in those years was a man named Nickerson Rogers, an easygoing outdoorsman she met in mid-1931. With Nick, Barbara got to live like a character from her first novel for a while, escaping from the world. In the summer of 1932, they walked the Appalachian Trail from Mount Katahdin in Maine down to the Massachusetts line. They then crossed the Atlantic to Spain, wandered Majorca, and hiked the Swiss Alps. They settled in Brookline, Massachusetts, and married in July 1934, and her early letters from the marriage sound lighter than anything she'd written in years. But the magic didn't last, and by 1937, she was confiding dissatisfaction in letters to friends, and by 1938, the cracks were widening. That October of 1937, the couple had rented an old farmhouse on Pulsifer Hill, near Squam Lake in New Hampshire, for the astonishing rate of $2.50 a month. I had to run that one through an inflation calculator, since I was pretty sure that was still well under $100 per month, and I was right. That old farmhouse cost the couple approximately $60 a month to rent in present-day money. Renting a farmhouse for a couple bucks a month wasn't the style at the time, not even in the 1930s, but I digress. The area became their escape, and while they didn't live there full-time, Barbara came to know its trails and woods closely. But back in Brookline, away from the rustic appeal of the farmhouse and nature, the marriage was officially failing. In 1939, she became convinced that Nick was seeing someone else, and then she learned it for certain. Her letters from that year are bleak, and in a line that says a great deal about her state of mind, she added that she figured she'd had it coming. She also mentioned needing something to help her sleep, since no matter how hard she tried, rest just wouldn't take her. Nick reportedly wanted a divorce, and in November 1939, she wrote to a friend that everything on the surface was terribly calm and terribly wrong. On Thursday, December 7th, 1939, Barbara came home from her secretarial job to the apartment on Kent Street and had an argument with Nick. Whatever was said, we only have his word for it, and some have speculated that he had a strong incentive to make himself look as good as possible. And count me amongst those people speculating, but I'll get to that in a moment, since I'm just going to stick to the facts for the time being. Sometime that evening, Barbara walked out the door carrying about $30, worth roughly $600 today, and a notebook of her writings. She was 25 years old, and no confirmed sighting of her exists after that night. What Nick did next is the part that investigators, and Barbara's own mother, could never quite get past. He waited 2 weeks before contacting the police, explaining later that she'd left of her own accord, and he'd assumed she would cool off and come back. When she didn't, he still waited, and he maintained from then on that Barbara had simply walked out of the marriage and, presumably, into a new life somewhere. It took him 4 months to request the official missing persons bulletin, the one that went out on April 22nd, 1940. Because it listed her under her married name, Barbara Rogers, not a single journalist connected the missing Brookline housewife to the famous author. The best camouflage she ever had turned out to be her married name, or perhaps, I should say, the best camouflage that Nick ever had. Her father broke his silence in his own way, and in May 1941, The Atlantic ran an anonymous essay titled, "To a Daughter, 1 Year Lost." In it, Wilson Follett circled his guilt and marveled that a person of his daughter's stature could simply evaporate without leaving a ripple. He signed it as her father, but not with his name, which meant even this public confession kept her disappearance a secret, since he didn't actually name her either. Also, if you needed another reason to think Wilson Follett is a terrible person, he didn't even bother to use his position of influence to help find his daughter. He simply wrote an anonymous letter where he whined and complained without doing anything whatsoever. Helen Follett, for her part, never accepted the quiet from her daughter. In 1952, 13 years after her daughter vanished, she pushed the Brookline police to reopen the matter and looked hard at Nick Rogers. Writing to him directly, she told him that his years of silence looked like the behavior of a man with something to hide. She promised she wouldn't spend her remaining years sitting still, while the question of whether Barbara was alive or dead went unanswered. The investigation went nowhere, since there was no body to find and no trail to follow, and officially at least, there was no crime. Wilson Follett passed away in early 1963, with the question his Atlantic essay raised still hanging in the air. The public finally learned the story in May 1966, when the psychologist Harold Greer McCurdy, working with Helen, published a study of Barbara's life. It was built from her letters and manuscripts, under a title that called her a genius, and called her later writings an unconscious autobiography. Newspapers that had celebrated her in 1927 now discovered, nearly 40 years late, that she'd been missing since 1939. By then, the trail was stone cold, and her papers ended up in a handful of archive boxes at Columbia University, and for decades, that was where the story sat. It took family to revive it, and a relative named Stephen Cook later assembled her correspondence into a published collection and built an archive of her work. Cook is also the reason why her final work, Lost Island, was ever published at all, being released in 2020. Now, in an unfortunate twist, the book was released on February 17th of that year, and let's just say the world was going to get a bit weird for a while. Because of this, there was really no meaningful way to promote the book through the usual channels, and when things went back to normal, it looks like the moment passed. The mystery of Barbara's disappearance, sadly, didn't have its Tiger King moment during those days when everyone was stuck inside. There's one more chapter, and it was hiding in plain sight for 70 years. On Thanksgiving Day 1948, a deer hunter named Harold Huckins was working through the woods at twilight near Durgan Brook in Holderness, New Hampshire. He came across bones scattered in the pine needles, and some of the foot bones were still inside a pair of size 7 moccasin-style shoes. Nearby lay the remnants of a wool overcoat, a canvas duffel bag, a metal flask, a medicine bottle, a purse, a compact enameled with a bird design, and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. Authorities decided the remains belonged to Elsie Whittemore, a 25-year-old from nearby Plymouth, who'd gone out for an evening walk on June 29, 1936. It was a tidy answer with obvious problems, but Elsie had left home carrying nothing. Yet this woman perished beside a packed duffel bag. There were a few other problems as well, since Elsie wore a size 5 shoe, not a 7. Elsie also didn't wear glasses at all, and her own in-laws couldn't recognize a single one of the recovered belongings. The county prosecutor closed the case on December 1st, 1948, declaring that the woman was Elsie and everyone moved on. Decades later, a novelist named Daniel Mills went through the old records and noticed what the investigators of 1948 apparently never considered. The remains were found roughly half a mile from the farmhouse Barbara and Nick had rented, in woods Barbara knew better than almost anyone. Nick reportedly kept the place into the summer of 1940, months after his wife vanished. The original examiner put the woman's height at just over 5 feet, which helped match her to the small-framed Elsie. When Mills reran the same bone measurements through modern forensic formulas, the estimate climbed to around 5'5" or taller, far closer to the 5'7" Barbara. Of course, I'll add here that Mills is a novelist with no specific expertise in forensics, but if this is accurate, it's a highly interesting finding. Barbara was also known to have worn horn-rimmed glasses, which were found with the remains. Barbara also left home carrying a bag, and her last letters mention medicine for sleep. That could theoretically indicate that she was in a disoriented state when she entered the woods. None of this is proof, and the bones themselves have since been lost, so no complete modern re-examination is possible. Anyway, if you thought we were leaving this segment without me going deeper on my own personal theory, think again. When I look at the disappearance of Barbara, I keep coming back to Nick Rogers, because nearly every critical detail depends on his version of events. According to Nick, Barbara came home on December 7th, 1939. Then they argued, and then she trotted out carrying about $30 and a notebook. Now I'll openly admit there's nothing inherently impossible about that sequence of events, given the facts that we have for this case. Barbara had run away before under different circumstances. She loved wilderness, and her marriage was collapsing. But Nick was also the husband she believed was having an affair, the man who reportedly wanted a divorce, and the last known person to see her alive. That does not make him guilty by any means, but it makes his conduct afterward incredibly important. And his conduct was strange. Nick waited a full 2 weeks before contacting police, which is unusual in and of itself. His explanation was that Barbara had left voluntarily, and he expected her to cool down and return. I can understand waiting a night, or perhaps even a few days, but 2 weeks seems highly suspicious. Barbara had disappeared without collecting her belongings, contacting friends, or returning to work, and at some point, she needed space, stops being a reasonable assumption. Then it took roughly 4 months for Nick to request an official missing person bulletin, and even worse, the bulletin identified her only as Barbara Rogers. It didn't emphasize that she was Barbara Newhall Follett, the once famous novelist, and as a result, the disappearance attracted virtually no attention. Whether intentional or not, Nick handled the report in the way most likely to keep Barbara invisible. If I had a formerly famous wife and she went missing in the 1930s, I would absolutely emphasize her maiden name, because I would want the case to go as wide as possible. Nick clearly didn't seem to have much interest in Barbara's disappearance being widely reported, as it would have been if her maiden name was used. There is also that idyllic farmhouse near Squam Lake with the cheap rent. Nick and Barbara had rented it together. Barbara knew the surrounding woods intimately, and Nick reportedly retained the property into the summer of 1940. 9 years later, unidentified female remains were discovered only half a mile away, and several details arguably fit Barbara better than Elsie. None of this proves Nick did anything at all to her, but it doesn't look good, and her mom had her suspicions about Nick all along. The remains are lost, so the most important forensic question may never be answered, and as of now they're officially attributed to Elsie. But Nick had motive, opportunity, and exclusive knowledge of Barbara's final known evening. He delayed involving police, accepted an almost non-existent investigation, and spent years insisting she had simply chosen to vanish. That may be innocent, but the circumstantial case against Nick certainly isn't weak, at least not in my view of the case. Anyway, clearly I'm more than a little bit passionate about this case, so let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Maybe I'm completely off base about Nick, but I can't help but think the results of this case would have been very different if he were ever seriously investigated.